territory. Thick, persistent, inescapable. It was the smell of survival, of hierarchy, of knowing your place. I had learned that lesson early, tattooed into my skin through years of whispered insults and carefully averted eyes. My mother had taught me to keep my head down, to make myself small, to survive in a world that had no use for wolves like us. Packless, mateless, existing only at the edges of a society that valued strength above all else. The claiming ceremony was 3 days away, and the entire pack territory buzzed with an electric anticipation that made my stomach twist into knots. Young, unmated females preened and practiced their most alluring gazes, hoping to catch the attention of ranked wolves. Perhaps even, though it was whispered only in the most daring of conversations, the Alpha King himself, Ronan Ashford. Even his name carried weight, spoken with reverence and fear in equal measure. He had ruled the Northern Territories for 7 years, ever since the death of his father in the border wars, and in that time had transformed a fractured collection of packs into an empire of order and absolute authority. I wasn't preparing for the ceremony. Girls like me didn't prepare for such things. We survived them. My fingers worked mechanically through the washing, scrubbing the fine linens that belonged to the ranked families. The water was ice cold, drawn from the stream that ran behind the communal quarters where my mother and I had been given shelter. If you could call a single room with walls so thin you could hear every cruel word spoken about you shelter. My hands were raw, the skin cracked and bleeding in places. But I had learned not to complain. Complaints drew attention, and attention drew cruelty. Look at her, scrubbing away like it'll change anything. The voice belonged to Serena Blackthorne, daughter of the Beta family, all glossy dark hair and cruel beauty. She stood with her circle of friends, girls born into power, raised on the certainty that the world would bend to accommodate them. Does she think if she works hard enough, someone will actually want her? Laughter rippled through the group, sharp as broken glass. I kept my eyes on the water, watching the soap dissolve into nothing. My mother's voice echoed in my memory, soft and insistent. Your father gave me something before he died, Evie. He made me promise to teach you. Compassion, he said, is not weakness. In a world of predators, the one who remembers mercy becomes something they cannot hunt. She becomes necessary. I had carried those words like a talisman, though I didn't always understand them. Compassion hadn't saved my mother from becoming a widow at 20. It hadn't saved me from a childhood of isolation. But it was all I had. Maybe she'll offer to wash the Alpha King's clothes, Serena continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I'm sure he's looking for a maid, not a mate. I squeezed the linen tighter, feeling the water run between my fingers. My wolf stirred beneath my skin, smaller than most, weaker, but present nonetheless. She wanted to snarl, to show teeth, to prove we weren't nothing, but I held her back. That was another lesson. Restraint kept you alive. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent when I finally finished, my back aching from hours bent over the washing stones. I gathered the clean linens into a woven basket, balancing it against my hip as I made my way toward the main hall, where they would be distributed to the ranked families. The path wound through the heart of the territory, past the training grounds where young warriors practiced their forms, past the council building where pack law was debated and decided, past the market square where vendors sold everything from fresh meat to carved talismans for luck. I kept to the edges, as always, invisible. The main hall rose before me like a cathedral of wood and stone, its peaked roof crowned with the silver wolf sigil of the Ashford bloodline. Pack members moved in and out with purpose, their voices a constant hum of activity. I slipped through a side entrance reserved for servants and the unclaimed, my footsteps silent on the polished floor. Inside, the hall was a study in contrasts. Heavy wooden beams crossed overhead, dark with age and ceremony. Tapestries depicting the pack's history hung along the walls. Battles won, territories claimed, alphas crowned. The air smelled of beeswax candles and the lingering traces of countless meals shared in community. It was beautiful and oppressive in equal measure, a reminder that beauty in this world belonged to those who could claim it through strength. I was halfway across the hall, focused on reaching the linen storage without drawing attention, when I heard it. A child's scream. Not the playful shriek of a pup at play, but something raw and terrified, the kind of sound that bypassed thought and went straight to instinct. My head snapped up, the basket nearly slipping from my grip. Through the tall windows that lined the eastern wall, I could see a small figure running, stumbling really, toward the hall. A little girl, no more than 5 or 6, her blonde hair tangled with leaves and dirt, her face streaked with tears. She burst through the main doors like a creature fleeing a fire, her small chest heaving with sobs that seemed too large for her tiny frame. Pack members turned to stare, conversations halting mid-sentence. The child's eyes swept the room wildly, searching, desperate, until they landed on the raised dais at the far end of the hall, where Ronan Ashford sat in council. I had seen the Alpha King from a distance before, of course. Everyone had. He was impossible to miss, tall enough to make other alphas seem ordinary, with dark hair that caught the light like a raven's wing and eyes the color of winter storms. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge, making the air around him seem to shimmer with barely contained force. He wore authority the way other men wore clothes, natural and absolute. He was terrifying, and the little girl was running straight toward him. "They're beating my mama!" Her voice cracked on the words, raw with panic. "Please, please, someone help! They're killing her!" The hall erupted into chaos. Guards moved forward to intercept the child, but she was small, and fear made her quick. She dodged between legs and around chairs, propelled by pure desperation. I watched as if frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. Around me, pack members muttered and whispered, some annoyed at the disruption, others curious about the spectacle. No one moved to help. The child reached the dais and threw herself at the Alpha King's feet, her small hands clutching at the dark fabric of his ceremonial robes. "Please," she sobbed, the word dissolving into hiccups and gasps. "Please, Alpha King, sir. They're hurting her so bad." Ronan Ashford's expression was unreadable, carved from stone. His council members shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of protocol for such an interruption. One of them, a grizzled wolf with scars marking his face, leaned forward to speak. "My lord, the child is clearly disturbed. We should have her removed so we can continue." "Where?" The Alpha King's voice cut through the noise like a blade, quiet but absolutely commanding. Every sound in the hall ceased instantly. He was looking down at the child with an intensity that made even me, standing 30 feet away, want to shrink back. "Where is your mother?" The little girl's whole body trembled. "The old mill," she managed between sobs, "by the eastern border. They said she broke pack law. They said she didn't show proper respect. But she didn't do anything wrong, I swear. She just..." Her voice dissolved into crying again, her small frame shaking with the force of her terror. For a long moment, Ronan Ashford didn't move, the silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, slowly, he rose from his seat, and the movement was like watching a mountain decide to walk. He was even larger standing, his presence filling the hall until there was no room for anything else. When he descended the dais, pack members scrambled to clear a path, their instincts recognizing something ancient and uncompromising in his bearing. He knelt before the child, a gesture so unexpected that several council members gasped audibly. An Alpha King did not kneel, not for anyone. But there he was, bringing himself to eye level with a terrified pup, his storm-gray eyes fixed on her face with an attention that seemed to still the very air. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice gentler now, though no less powerful. "Lily," the child stammered. "Lily." He repeated it like an oath. "I am going to the old mill now. Do you understand? Your mother will not be harmed further." The words were simple, but they resonated through the hall like a thunderclap. This was not a discussion. This was not a debate. This was law being written in real time. Absolute and unquestionable. Ronan Ashford rose to his full height and turned to his guards. "With me." Now, 4 wolves moved instantly, falling into formation behind him. He strode toward the doors with purpose, his long coat swirling behind him like shadows given form. And then, I still don't know what possessed me. My body moved before my mind could intervene. I set down the basket of linens and followed. Word count, 1,646. I need to extend this block to reach the 2,150 to 300 word requirement. Let me continue. Perhaps it was the echo of my mother's words about compassion. Perhaps it was the image of that little girl's terrified face, so small and so desperate. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something my wolf recognized before I did. A pull, a thread of connection I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. The crowd parted for the Alpha King like water before a ship's prow, and I slipped into that wake, keeping myself small and unnoticed. My heart hammered so hard I thought surely someone would hear it, would turn and demand to know what a nobody like me thought she was doing following the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories. But no one looked back. All eyes were on Ronan Ashford, on the coiled danger in his movements, on the promise of violence that hung around him like a cloak. The old mill sat at the eastern edge of Packlands, where the forest grew thick and the laws of civilization grew thin. It had been abandoned for years, used now only for storage, and apparently for the kind of pack justice that preferred no witnesses. As we approached, I could hear raised voices, the sound of impact, flesh against flesh, and a woman's cry, weak and hoarse as if she'd been screaming for hours. My stomach turned. I had seen pack justice before. Sometimes you survived it. Sometimes you didn't. The Alpha King didn't slow his pace, didn't announce himself. He simply walked through the mill's broken doorway, and the temperature of the world seemed to drop 10 degrees. Inside, 3 wolves had a woman cornered against the far wall. She was on her knees, her face already swelling, blood trailing from a split lip. Her attackers were mid-rank enforcers, the kind who wielded their small power with enthusiastic cruelty. They had been laughing. The sound died in their throats when they saw who stood in the doorway. "My lord," the largest one began, his face going pale. "Explain. One word." Ronan Ashford's voice was soft as falling snow and twice as deadly. The enforcer's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. His companions took an instinctive step back, their wolves recognizing the apex predator in their midst and screaming at them to run. But running from an Alpha King was an admission of guilt, and guilt demanded punishment. "The enforcer tried again, his voice cracking. "She questioned the preparations for the claiming ceremony, my lord, said it was barbaric, said unmated females shouldn't be paraded like livestock. It was disrespectful to pack tradition to." "And this?" Ronan Ashford gestured toward the bleeding woman without looking away from the enforcer. "This is tradition? We were enforcing pack law. You were indulging yourselves." The Alpha King moved forward, and though he didn't raise his voice, every syllable carried the weight of absolute authority. "Pack law does not permit the beating of females. Pack law does not permit 3 wolves to attack one. And pack law most certainly does not permit enforcers to act without trial or witness." The woman on the floor was crying silently now, her body curled protectively around her ribs. I wanted to go to her, to help her. But I was frozen in the doorway, barely breathing, terrified that any movement would draw attention to my presence where I had no right to be. "Strip their ranks." Ronan Ashford's command was directed at the guards behind him. "Remove them from enforcement duty. They'll spend the next month on border patrol in the Deadlands. Perhaps cold and isolation will teach them what power is actually for." The 3 former enforcers looked as though they'd been struck. The Deadlands were the harshest assignment in pack territory, frozen, dangerous, where rogues and wild things tested the boundaries constantly. It was exile without the name, punishment without execution, mercy and cruelty wrapped into one. The guards moved efficiently, herding the disgraced wolves toward the door. As they passed me, I pressed myself against the wall, making myself smaller, invisible. One of them glanced at me with pure hatred, as if somehow this was my fault for witnessing his shame. I looked away. When they were gone, Ronan Ashford finally moved toward the injured woman. He knelt again, that same gesture that had shocked the hall. And his voice, when he spoke, carried a gentleness I hadn't thought possible from someone so powerful. "You're safe now," he said simply. The woman looked up at him with eyes full of disbelief and pain. "My daughter is unharmed. She's brave. She saved you." A sob broke from the woman's throat, relief and anguish mixing into something raw and human. The Alpha King helped her to her feet, with a care that seemed at odds with the violence that had hummed beneath his skin moments before. He was a study in contradictions, brutal and gentle, terrifying and protective, a blade that knew when to cut and when to sheath itself. And then his eyes found me in the doorway. I froze, caught like prey in a hunter's gaze. Those storm-gray eyes swept over me, taking in my worn clothes, my bleeding hands, my pale hair that caught the dying light filtering through the mill's broken roof. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something he couldn't quite name. "You," he said, his voice neutral but commanding. "Come here." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but you didn't disobey a direct order from an Alpha King. My legs moved on their own, carrying me forward until I stood close enough to see the flecks of darker gray in his irises, close enough to feel the heat that radiated from his powerful frame. "Help her back to the healer's quarters," he instructed, his gaze never leaving my face. "Stay with her until she's been treated." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Carefully, I moved to the woman's other side, supporting her weight as gently as I could. She leaned into me, her breathing labored, and I felt her pain as if it were my own. As we turned to leave, the Alpha King spoke again. "What's your name?" I looked back, startled that he would ask. "Evelyn," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Evelyn Thorne." Something shifted in his expression, so subtle I might have imagined it. "Evelyn Thorne," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "Thank you." And there, in a ruined mill stained with blood and injustice, with those two simple words from the most powerful wolf I had ever known, something in my world tilted on its axis and began, impossibly, to change. The healer's quarters occupied a stone building near the heart of Pack territory, its windows always lit, its door always open. Maeve Silverstream had tended the Northern Pack's wounded for 40 years, her hands as steady as her temperament was fierce. She took one look at the woman I supported, whose name I learned was Charlotte, and her weathered face hardened into lines of fury. "Who did this?" she demanded, already guiding us toward a cushioned bench. "It's been handled," I said quietly, remembering the cold finality in the Alpha King's voice. "They've been punished." Maeve's sharp eyes found mine, reading something in my expression that made her nod once, satisfied. She moved with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies, clean cloth, salves that smelled of comfrey and arnica, a tonic for pain. I stayed close to Charlotte, holding her hand as Maeve worked, feeling each flinch and wince as if they were my own. Little Lily burst through the door halfway through the treatment, her small face crumpling with relief when she saw her mother. She threw herself into Charlotte's arms with a force that made the woman gasp in pain, but Charlotte held her daughter anyway, tears streaming down her bruised face. "You were so brave," Charlotte whispered into her daughter's tangled hair. "So brave, my love." I stepped back to give them privacy, but Lily's hand shot out and caught my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so small. "You followed him," she said, her voice still thick with tears but certain. "I saw you." "You followed the Alpha King." Charlotte's eyes widened, finding my face with new understanding. "You didn't have to do that. I know," I said simply, because what other explanation could I offer? I didn't understand it myself, that pull, that inexplicable need to witness what happened next, to be present for something I couldn't name. Maeve finished her ministrations and prescribed 3 days of rest, her tone brooking no argument. Charlotte would stay in the healer's quarters, where she could be monitored, and Lily would stay with her. As I turned to leave, Charlotte called my name, "Evelyn." She struggled to sit up straighter despite Maeve's disapproving cluck. "Thank you. For being there. For caring when no one else did." The words settled into my chest, warm and unexpected. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and slipped out into the evening air. The sky had deepened to purple, the first stars emerging like pinpricks in fabric. The Pack territory hummed with its usual evening rhythms, warriors returning from patrol, families gathering for meals, the constant undercurrent of pack bonds that connected everyone in invisible threads. Everyone, except me. I had learned to navigate this world as a ghost, present, but not part of it, always on the periphery of belonging. I was nearly back to the communal quarters when I heard my name again. "Evelyn Thorne." The voice was male, cultured, carrying an authority that made my spine straighten instinctively. I turned to find a man in his 50s approaching, his gray-streaked hair pulled back, his clothing marking him as high-ranking. I recognized him from council meetings I'd glimpsed. Garrett Ironwood, the Alpha King's chief advisor. "Sir?" I said carefully, dipping my head in respect. His shrewd eyes studied me with an intensity that made me want to squirm. "The Alpha King has requested your presence tomorrow evening. There will be a gathering of ranked families to finalize preparations for the claiming ceremony. You are to attend." My heart stopped. I don't understand. I'm not ranked. I don't belong." "The Alpha King's requests are not subject to debate," Garrett said, though not unkindly. "You will be provided appropriate clothing. Someone will escort you at sunset tomorrow." He paused, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "What you did today, following him, helping that woman," it did not go unnoticed. Before I could formulate a response, he was gone, disappearing into the evening shadows with the efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of delivering shocking news and departing before questions could be asked. I stood frozen in the growing darkness, my mind spinning. An invitation to a ranked gathering. Me. Evelyn Thorne, the invisible girl, the packless orphan who existed in the margins of pack society. It made no sense. It felt like a trap, or a joke, or some cosmic mistake that would be corrected before tomorrow evening arrived. But as I finally forced my feet to move, carrying me back to the small room I shared with my mother, I felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath my ribs. Not quite hope. I had learned not to trust hope, but something adjacent to it. A possibility. A crack in the walls that had defined my entire existence. My mother was waiting when I entered, her sewing set aside, her face drawn with worry. Margaret Thorne had been beautiful once, before grief and hardship had carved lines around her eyes and silver into her blonde hair. She stood when she saw me, her hands reaching for mine, and gasped at the dried blood on my knuckles. "What happened?" she demanded, already reaching for the water basin. I told her everything. The little girl's scream, the Alpha King's response, the mill, Charlotte's injuries, the punishment he'd delivered without hesitation. And finally, impossibly, the invitation that made no sense. My mother's hands stilled in their gentle cleaning of my wounds. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. "Your father," she said softly, "would have done the same thing. Followed, I mean. When he saw injustice, when he saw someone in need, he couldn't help but move toward it. Compassion as action, not just feeling." She cupped my face with damp, gentle hands. "I see him in you so clearly sometimes it steals my breath." "Mama," I whispered. "I don't know what this means. Why would the Alpha King invite someone like me to a ranked gathering?" She smiled, sad and knowing. "Perhaps, my darling girl, he sees what I see. That strength isn't always about dominance. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is care when caring makes you vulnerable." That night, I lay awake on my thin mattress, staring at the ceiling where moonlight painted silver patterns through the gaps in the roof. My wolf stirred restlessly beneath my skin, sensing the shift in the world around us, the way the ground had become unstable. Tomorrow would bring answers, or more questions, or perhaps disaster. In a society built on hierarchy and power, invitations from Alpha Kings didn't come without consequence. But as I finally drifted toward sleep, I found myself remembering the moment in the mill when Ronan Ashford's eyes had found mine. The way he'd looked at me, not through me as most did, but at me. Seeing something, recognizing something, and I wondered, with a flutter in my chest that felt dangerous and thrilling, what exactly he had seen. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. I completed my usual tasks, washing, mending, helping in the kitchens. But my mind was elsewhere, circling around the approaching evening like a moth around flame. Whispers followed me through the pack territory, rumors spreading with the efficiency of wildfire. The invisible girl had been summoned by the Alpha King. Servants gossiped. Ranked wolves speculated. Serena Blackthorne and her circle watched me with narrowed eyes, their expressions mixing disbelief with barely concealed hostility. I tried to ignore it all, keeping my head down, but invisibility had become impossible. I had been noticed, and in pack society, being noticed was dangerous. An hour before sunset, a knock sounded at our door. My mother opened it to reveal a middle-aged woman with kind eyes carrying a wrapped bundle. "For Evelyn," she said simply, handing over the package before departing without further explanation. Inside was a dress, not the fine silks and elaborate embroidery that ranked females wore, but something simpler, more elegant. Deep forest green fabric that would complement my pale hair and fair skin. The cut modest but flattering, the stitching impeccable. My mother helped me into it, her fingers trembling slightly as she fastened the small buttons along the back. "You look beautiful," she whispered, tears tracking down her cheeks. "Your father would be so proud." I studied my reflection in the small, cracked mirror we owned, the only one in our quarters. The girl looking back was familiar and foreign all at once. Same pale blue eyes, same delicate features that had never quite fit pack standards of strength and beauty, but the dress transformed something, lent me a dignity I hadn't known I could possess. My escort arrived precisely at sunset, a young guard named Thomas, who had always been kind in his few interactions with me. He offered his arm with genuine courtesy, and together we walked toward the Alpha King's residence, a sprawling building of stone and timber that dominated the highest point of pack territory. The path wound upward through carefully maintained grounds, where ancient trees stood sentinel. Other ranked wolves and their families moved in the same direction, their fine clothes rustling, their conversation animated. They glanced at me with varying degrees of curiosity, confusion, and in some cases outright disdain. I kept my eyes forward, my breathing steady, reminding myself that I had been invited. I had every right to be here. The Alpha King's hall was magnificent. High ceilings crossed with dark beams, walls lined with tapestries and weapons from generations past. A massive fireplace where flames danced and crackled. Long tables had been arranged in a U-shape, already laden with food and drink. Ranked families found their designated places with practiced ease, their movements reflecting years of understanding exactly where they belonged in the pack hierarchy. I stood uncertainly near the entrance, acutely aware that I had no designated place, no family to sit with, no clear reason for being here beyond an Alpha King's incomprehensible request. "Evelyn Thorne." The voice came from my left, deep and unmistakable. I turned to find Ronan Ashford standing less than 3 feet away, and the impact of his presence up close, without the buffer of chaos or crisis, nearly stole my breath. He was dressed formally in dark clothing that emphasized his powerful build, his hair pulled back to reveal the strong lines of his face, but it was his eyes that held me captive. Those storm-gray depths that seemed to see past every defense I'd ever built. "My lord," I managed, dropping into a curtsy that felt clumsy despite my mother's years of teaching me proper forms. "Walk with me," he said, and it wasn't quite a command, wasn't quite a request, something in between. He moved toward a side door that led to a private terrace, and I followed because what else could I do? My heart hammered so loudly I was certain he could hear it. Behind us, I felt the weight of every ranked wolf's stare burning into my back, their shock and speculation almost tangible. The terrace overlooked the territory below, the pack lands spreading out in every direction under the deepening twilight. The air was cooler here, carrying the scent of pine and approaching night. Ronan Ashford stood at the stone railing, his profile sharp against the dimming sky. "Do you know why I invited you here?" he asked without preamble. "No, my lord," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to face me fully, and the intensity of his gaze made me want to look away, but something, pride perhaps, or that stubborn core my father had allegedly passed to me, kept my eyes on his. "Yesterday," he said carefully, "when that child came to me desperate and terrified, every ranked wolf in that hall did nothing. They watched, they judged, they waited to see what I would do before deciding their own response." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But you followed. Without rank, without protection, without any reason to involve yourself, you followed." I struggled to find words. I just thought someone should, in case help was needed. In case help was needed, he repeated, and something flickered in his expression that might have been approval. Do you understand how rare that is? That instinct to move toward danger, toward need, without calculating the personal cost first? I didn't know how to answer, so I said nothing. Ronan Ashford moved closer, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. I've spent 7 years trying to build something better than what my father left me. A pack where strength doesn't mean cruelty, where power is used to protect rather than oppress. But I can't do it alone. I need wolves who understand that compassion isn't weakness. His voice dropped lower, intimate. I think you might be one of them, my breath caught. My lord, I'm nobody. I have no rank, no family name, no, you have courage, he interrupted gently. That's rarer than any title. Before I could respond, before I could process the implications of what he was saying, the door to the terrace opened. Garrett Ironwood stepped out, his expression apologetic. My lord, the families are waiting. Ronan nodded once, then returned his attention to me. Sit beside me tonight, he said simply. At the head table. My eyes widened. The head table, where only the Alpha King and his most trusted advisors sat, where I would be visible to everyone, exposed, subject to scrutiny and judgment and... Trust me, he said quietly, and somehow, impossibly, I found myself nodding. We returned to the hall together, and the silence that fell was absolute. Every conversation died, every eye turned, and when Ronan Ashford guided me to the seat at his right hand, the seat of honor, traditionally reserved for a future mate or the highest-ranked female, the shock rippled through the room like a physical force. I sat, because he was waiting for me to sit. I lifted my chin because my mother had taught me that dignity was something you carried, not something granted by others, and when Serena Blackthorn's poisonous gaze found mine from across the room, I didn't look away. The Alpha King had asked me to trust him. So, terrified and exhilarated and utterly out of my depth, I did. Dinner was an exercise in controlled chaos masked as civility. Conversations flowed around the tables, discussions of territory boundaries, trade agreements with neighboring packs, preparations for the claiming ceremony that loomed just 2 days away. I picked at my food, acutely aware of every glance thrown in my direction, every whispered speculation that never quite reached my ears, but painted itself clearly across hostile faces. Ronan spoke with his advisors, his voice measured and authoritative, but I noticed the way his attention would drift periodically to me, checking without obvious checking. It was unsettling and oddly comforting in equal measure, this awareness that I wasn't alone in my exposure, that the Alpha King himself was monitoring the room's reaction to my presence. Midway through the meal, a woman approached the head table. She was striking in the way that power makes people striking, tall, dark-haired, her bearing speaking of generations of rank and privilege. I recognized her as Diana Ravencroft, daughter of the Northern Pack's most influential council family. Alpha King, she said, her voice smooth as honey and twice as cloying. I hope I'm not interrupting, but I wanted to personally confirm the arrangements for the claiming ceremony. My family has prepared extensively to ensure everything meets your standards. I'm confident it will be handled appropriately, Ronan replied, his tone neutral, but carrying a dismissive edge that made Diana's smile tighten almost imperceptibly. Her eyes slid to me, and the temperature seemed to drop. I don't believe we've been introduced, she said, though we both knew she knew exactly who I was. Everyone knew by now. Evelyn Thorne, I said quietly, meeting her gaze despite the predatory gleam in it. Thorne, Diana repeated, as if tasting the name and finding it lacking. I'm not familiar with that bloodline. Are you recently arrived in Pack territory? The question was designed to expose, to force me to admit my lack of lineage, my absence of rank, my fundamental unsuitability for sitting where I sat. Around us, conversations had quieted. People were listening. My family has been here for 20 years, I answered, keeping my voice steady. My father died in service to the Pack during the border wars. It was true, if incomplete. My father had fought and died, but he'd been a low-ranked warrior, unmated at the time of his death, his sacrifice acknowledged with a brief ceremony and then forgotten. My mother, pregnant and alone, had been given shelter out of obligation, not honor. Something flickered across Diana's face. Surprise, perhaps, that I would claim connection to service rather than retreat into invisibility. How commendable, she said, the word dripping with condescension. The Alpha King has always been generous with those less fortunate. The implication was clear. I was charity, an object of pity seated above my station through the indulgence of a powerful male. Before I could respond, before I even knew how to respond, Ronan's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Evelyn is here because she demonstrated qualities I value in pack members, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Courage, compassion, the ability to act when action is needed, rather than waiting for permission or calculating advantage. He turned his storm-gray eyes on Diana, and I watched her pale under the weight of his attention. These are not qualities that require bloodline or rank. They require character. The silence that followed was deafening. Diana's composure cracked for just a moment, long enough for fury and humiliation to flash across her features before she smoothed them into a practiced mask of grace. "Of course, Alpha King," she said, bowing her head. "I meant no disrespect." She retreated, her spine rigid with barely suppressed anger, and conversations gradually resumed. But the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer just an anomaly to be puzzled over. I was something the Alpha King had publicly defended, which made me either very dangerous or very valuable, depending on who was doing the calculating. I felt the weight of it settling over my shoulders, heavy as chains. Ronan leaned closer, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Are you all right?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. My hands were trembling slightly in my lap, adrenaline coursing through my system. I had just been defended by an Alpha King in front of the pack's most powerful families. The implications were staggering, the consequences unpredictable. "This is what it means," he said quietly, his eyes on the room but his words clearly meant for me, to challenge how things have always been. "There will always be those who resist, who see change as threat rather than evolution." He paused. "But there will also be those who recognize truth when they hear it, who understand that strength comes in many forms." I turned to look at him then, really look at him, and saw something I hadn't expected beneath the authority and power. Loneliness. It radiated from him in waves, subtle but unmistakable once you knew to look for it. He was surrounded by advisors and warriors and pack members who would die at his command, but he was fundamentally alone. The weight of leadership, of being the strongest in every room, had isolated him as surely as my lack of rank had isolated me. We were both invisible, I realized, just in different ways. The thought should have been absurd, comparing my situation to that of an Alpha King. But in that moment, with the noise of the hall washing over us, and his gray eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my breath catch, it felt like truth. "Why are you really doing this?" I asked quietly. "Inviting me here? Defending me? Risking your reputation on someone you barely know?" Ronan was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that felt like confession. "Because 7 years ago, I watched my father rule through fear and violence. I watched him crush anyone who showed what he considered weakness, kindness, mercy, compassion. And I swore when I took his place that I would build something different." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "But it's harder than I thought, to change a culture, to convince wolves raised on dominance that there's another way. I need allies who understand instinctively what I'm trying to accomplish. And yesterday, when you followed me without hesitation, without thought for yourself, I saw someone who might be that kind of ally." "I'm not strong," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. "I'm not a warrior or a leader. I'm just—" "You're brave," he interrupted gently, "and that's different from being unafraid. Bravery is moving forward despite fear. That's what I need. What this pack needs." Before I could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. A messenger had arrived, breathless and agitated, his clothes marked with mud from hard travel. Garrett Ironwood met him first, their low conversation tense. Then Garrett's face went pale, and he turned toward the head table with an expression that made my stomach drop. "My lord," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet, We have a situation. Rogues have been spotted near the southern border. A large group, 30, maybe more. They're moving toward the outer settlements. The atmosphere in the hall transformed instantly. Warriors straightened, their easy expressions hardening into readiness. Families with homes near the southern border exchanged worried glances. Ronan stood, his movement fluid and purposeful, and when he spoke, his voice carried absolute command. Council members with me. Warriors, prepare for immediate deployment. Families with vulnerable members in the southern settlements, coordinate evacuation protocols now. His eyes swept the room, missing nothing. This gathering is concluded. Move with purpose, not panic. The hall erupted into controlled chaos. People moving, plans forming, the pack's defensive machinery activating with practiced efficiency. I stood as well, uncertain of my place in this sudden crisis, feeling the uselessness of my presence acutely. Ronan's hand caught my arm gently, stopping me. You should return to your quarters. It's safest there. I nodded, already turning to leave, but his grip tightened fractionally. Evelyn. He waited until I looked at him. This conversation isn't finished. When this is handled, I'd like to speak with you again. If you're willing. Of course, my lord, I managed. Something in his expression softened. Ronan, he said quietly. When we're alone, you can call me Ronan. Then he was gone, swept into the urgent current of leadership and crisis management, surrounded by advisors and warriors all demanding his attention, his decisions, his strength. I watched him go, feeling oddly bereft, as if something fragile and new had been interrupted before it could fully form. Thomas appeared at my elbow, ready to escort me back, and I followed numbly through the emptying hall and out into the night. The temperature had dropped, the sky clear and full of stars that seemed impossibly distant. Pack territory buzzed with activity, warriors arming themselves, scouts departing for reconnaissance, families securing their homes. When I finally reached the communal quarters, my mother was waiting with wide, worried eyes. She pulled me inside, her hands checking me over as if I might have been injured somehow. What happened? She demanded. The whole territory is mobilizing. There are rumors, rogues, an attack, the southern border, I confirmed, helping her secure the flimsy lock on our door. More psychological comfort than actual protection. A large group of rogues moving toward the settlements. My mother's face went pale. She had lived through rogue attacks before, had lost my father to violence on the borders. I saw the memories moving behind her eyes, dark and haunting. We'll be safe here, I said, with more confidence than I felt. The warriors will handle it. The Alpha King will handle it, she nodded. But her hands were shaking as she prepared tea neither of us would drink. We sat together on the thin mattresses, listening to the sounds of preparation beyond our walls. Weapons being sharpened, horses being saddled, warriors calling to each other in the pre-battle language of controlled aggression. Tell me about tonight, my mother said finally, clearly trying to distract herself from darker thoughts. The gathering. What was it like? So I told her, leaving nothing out. The magnificent hall, the food I'd barely touched, Diana's veiled attack, Ronan's defense, and finally, that strange moment of connection where I'd seen past the Alpha King to the lonely man beneath. My mother listened with an expression that shifted between concern and something that looked almost like hope. When I finished, she took my hands in hers. Your father, she said softly, told me once that true power isn't about dominance. It's about connection, about seeing people, really seeing them, and being seen in return. He said that kind of power is rarer and more valuable than any amount of physical strength. She squeezed my hands gently. I think the Alpha King sees you, Evie. Really sees you. And I think that terrifies and attracts him in equal measure. Mama, he barely knows me. This isn't... It can't be... Can't be what? She asked, her eyes knowing. A beginning? A possibility? A door opening to something you never thought you could have? I wanted to argue. To list all the reasons why an Alpha King and a nobody like me existing in the same sphere was absurd, impossible, dangerous. But the words wouldn't come, because somewhere in the past 2 days, something had shifted in my understanding of the world. The walls that had always defined my place had developed cracks, and light was bleeding through. Outside, a wolf howled. The signal for warriors to assemble. It was answered by others, a chorus of sound that spoke of unity and strength and readiness to defend what was theirs. I moved to our small window, watching as shapes moved through the darkness, powerful and purposeful. Somewhere out there, Ronan was leading them, facing danger, protecting his pack with the same absolute commitment he'd shown when kneeling before a terrified child or defending an invisible girl at a ranked gathering. And I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I prayed. Not to the moon goddess, whose favor had never seemed to extend to wolves like me, but to whatever forces governed fate and chance, and the impossible moments where everything could change. I prayed that he would be safe, that he would return, that the conversation he'd promised, the one that felt like standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, would still be waiting when the danger passed. Because for the first time in my life, I wanted something more than just survival. I wanted a future I couldn't yet name. The attack came 3 hours before dawn. I woke to the sound of screaming, not the organized calls of warriors preparing for battle, but the raw, terrified shrieks of people facing immediate danger. My mother was already awake, her face ashen in the dim light of our single candle. Outside, the night had erupted into chaos. "They got through," she whispered, her voice tight with the kind of fear that came from experience. "The rogues. They got through the southern defenses." I was on my feet instantly, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through our thin walls, I could hear running footsteps, shouted orders, the distinctive clash of combat. The communal quarters sat near the center of pack territory, supposedly safe, supposedly protected. But rogue wolves didn't follow predictable patterns. They were desperate, unpredictable, driven by hunger and madness in equal measure. A crash sounded somewhere close. Wood splintering, something heavy hitting the ground. My mother grabbed my arm, her grip painful in its intensity. "The storage cellar," she said urgently. "Under the kitchens. We can hide there until—" The door to our room exploded inward. 3 rogues filled the doorway, their eyes wild with bloodlust, their forms twisted by years of living outside pack structure and sanity. They moved with the jerky, unpredictable movements of predators who had forgotten how to be anything else. The largest one, a male with matted fur and scars covering half his face, locked eyes on my mother, and I saw his intent written clearly in his feral grin. My wolf surged forward, smaller and weaker than most, but fierce with protective instinct. I shifted partially, just enough to bare teeth and claws, placing myself between the rogues and my mother. It was futile. I knew it was futile, but my father's words echoed through my mind. Compassion is not weakness. In a world of predators, the one who remembers mercy becomes something they cannot hunt. She becomes necessary, but these creatures had forgotten mercy existed. "Run!" I snarled at my mother, my voice distorted by the partial shift. "Now!" She hesitated for a heartbeat, a mother's instinct warring with survival, then stumbled backward toward the window. The rogues moved forward, and I lunged, knowing I couldn't win but unable to do anything else. My claws caught the scarred male's shoulder, drawing blood, and he roared with fury that shook the walls. His backhand sent me flying across the small room. I hit the wall hard enough to drive the air from my lungs, stars exploding across my vision. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard my mother scream, heard the rogues laughing, a sound devoid of anything human or sane. Then another sound cut through the chaos, a howl that made every hair on my body stand on end, that resonated with power so absolute it seemed to still the air itself, the Alpha King. The rogues froze, their primitive instincts recognizing an apex predator. The scarred male turned toward the doorway, just as Ronan Ashford appeared, and I had never seen anything more terrifying or beautiful in my life. He was fully shifted, a massive wolf the color of midnight with those storm-gray eyes blazing with lethal intent. Blood marked his dark fur, evidence of battles already fought, but he moved with undiminished strength and purpose. He didn't hesitate, didn't offer mercy or warning. He simply attacked. What followed was brutality stripped of pretense, efficient, devastating, absolute. Ronan moved through the rogues like death given form, his jaws finding throats, his claws opening vital arteries. The scarred male tried to fight back, but it was like watching a house cat challenge a tiger. Within seconds, it was over. 3 bodies lay motionless on our floor, and the Alpha King stood among them, his chest heaving, his fur matted with blood that wasn't his own. He shifted back to human form, his powerful frame still radiating violence barely contained. His eyes found mine where I'd collapsed against the wall, swept over me with an intensity that felt like a physical touch, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, strained with adrenaline and something deeper. I shook my head, not trusting my voice. My mother appeared from behind the overturned furniture where she'd taken shelter, her face streaming with tears. "Thank you," she gasped. "Thank you, Alpha King, we would have—" "Where are the other residents?" Ronan interrupted, his attention already shifting to the broader crisis. "This building should have been evacuated hours ago." "Most went to the central hall," my mother answered, struggling to steady herself. "We thought we'd be safe here, away from the borders." Ronan's jaw tightened, fury and frustration warring in his expression. The rogues split their forces, sent a small group toward the southern settlements as a diversion, while the main force circled north. A coordinated attack. He looked at me again, and something in his gaze made my breath catch. "We need to move. Now. The central hall is compromised. There are rogues inside the territory, too many for the current guard to handle alone." He helped me to my feet, his hand steady despite the violence they'd just delivered, and I felt the heat of his skin against mine, the barely controlled power thrumming through him. My mother gathered a few essentials with shaking hands, and then we were moving, Ronan guiding us through corridors I'd known my entire life but which now felt alien and dangerous. Outside, pack territory had transformed into a war zone. Buildings burned in the distance, casting flickering orange light across everything. Warriors engaged rogues in brutal combat, while families fled toward designated safe points. The air tasted of smoke and blood and fear. Ronan moved us swiftly toward the Alpha King's residence, the most fortified structure in the territory. Other pack members had already sought shelter there, guarded by elite warriors whose competence showed in every movement. Garrett Ironwood stood at the entrance, coordinating defenses, his face grim but controlled. "The healer's quarters," Ronan said sharply. "Status?" "Secured, my lord. Maeve and her patients are safe." Garrett's eyes flicked to me and my mother. "We've reinforced all critical structures. The rogues are being pushed back, but casualties are mounting." "How many?" 17 wounded. 4, Garrett hesitated. 4 dead, my lord. 2 warriors. 2 civilians caught before evacuation completed. I felt my mother's hand find mine, squeezing tight. 4 lives extinguished, because rogues had found a way through defenses that should have held. Because something, had coordinated an attack more sophisticated than random violence. Ronan's expression hardened into something ancient and implacable. "Finish the evacuation. Every non-combatant inside fortified structures within the hour. Double guards on all entry points." He turned to me, and the shift in his demeanor was subtle, but present, the absolute authority softening fractionally. "Stay here. This building is the safest place in the territory. Garrett will ensure you and your mother have everything you need. Where are you going?" The question escaped before I could stop it, and I heard the fear in my own voice, not for myself, but for him. Something flickered in his storm-gray eyes. To end this. These rogues didn't organize themselves. Someone is leading them, and I intend to find out who. He turned to leave, but my hand shot out, catching his arm. The gesture was presumptuous, inappropriate. A nobody touching an Alpha King without permission. But I couldn't stop myself. "Be careful," I whispered, inadequate and insufficient, but all I had to offer. Ronan looked down at where my hand rested on his forearm, then back at my face, and the intensity in his gaze made my heart stutter. "I will return," he said, the words carrying the weight of a promise. "We have unfinished business, you and I." Then he was gone, disappearing into the smoke and chaos with several elite warriors falling in behind him. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching until his form was swallowed by darkness and distance. Garrett cleared his throat gently. "Come inside, Evelyn. You and your mother will be safe here." The Alpha King's residence interior was organized chaos, wounded being tended, families huddled together, warriors receiving orders and departing to rejoin the fight. Garrett directed us to a sitting room where other displaced pack members had gathered, providing blankets and water, speaking calmly despite the crisis raging outside. My mother sank onto a cushioned bench, the adrenaline finally leaving her system, replaced by trembling exhaustion. I sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, and we waited. Time became elastic, minutes stretching into hours or perhaps collapsing into seconds. I couldn't tell. Warriors came and went, bringing updates. The rogues were being driven back. The southern border had been reinforced. The Alpha King was leading a strike team to eliminate the rogue leaders. I found myself watching the doorway compulsively, waiting for a familiar form to appear. "He'll be fine," a quiet voice said beside me. I turned to find a young woman, maybe a few years older than me, with auburn hair and kind eyes. The Alpha King, I mean. I've seen him in battle before. He's unstoppable. "I don't even know him," I said softly, though it felt like a lie. How could I not know someone who had defended me publicly, saved my life, looked at me like I mattered? The woman smiled. "I'm Elena. My family serves in the household guard." "I saw you at the gathering last night, at the head table." She paused. That took courage. Diana Ravencroft is dangerous when she feels threatened. "I didn't do anything," I protested. "I just sat where the Alpha King told me to sit." "Exactly." Elena's expression turned serious. "You trusted him. In front of everyone, knowing it would make you a target, you trusted his judgment. That's not nothing, Evelyn." Before I could respond, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. Warriors were returning, bloodied, exhausted, but moving with the satisfaction of victory rather than the desperation of defeat. And at the center of them, towering and magnificent despite his injuries, walked Ronan Ashford. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and everything else fell away. He moved toward me with purpose, dismissing advisors who tried to claim his attention, his focus absolute. When he reached me, he dropped to one knee, that same gesture he'd used with little Lily, reducing himself to meet someone eye to eye, and his bloodied hands cupped my face with impossible gentleness. "You're all right," he breathed. And it wasn't a question. It was reassurance to himself, confirmation that whatever he'd feared hadn't come to pass. "You came back," I whispered, my hands coming up to cover his, heedless of the blood and dirt and the fact that an entire room full of pack members was witnessing this moment. "I promised," he said simply. Around us, I heard gasps, whispers, the sharp intake of breath that meant people were drawing conclusions, forming opinions, deciding what this meant. An Alpha King kneeling before an invisible girl, touching her face like she was precious, looking at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered, but Ronan didn't seem to notice or care. His thumb brushed across my cheekbone, tender and possessive in equal measure. "I need to address the pack," he said quietly, "to account for casualties, explain what happened, ensure everyone that the threat is contained. But then..." He paused, his eyes searching mine. "Then I need to speak with you, properly, without interruptions or crises or the weight of witnesses." "Yes," I managed, the word barely audible. He stood, his hands reluctantly leaving my face, and I felt their absence like a physical loss. He turned to address the room, his voice carrying that absolute authority that made people listen without conscious choice. "The rogues have been eliminated or driven from our territory. The threat is over." Relief rippled through the gathered pack members. But make no mistake, this was not a random attack. This was coordinated, planned, meant to test our defenses and divide our forces. Someone is organizing rogues, giving them purpose beyond mere survival. His gaze swept the room. "We will investigate. We will find whoever is responsible. And we will ensure this never happens again." The promise in his words was steel-edged and absolute. This was the Alpha King in full command. Protector, warrior, leader who would hunt threats to the edge of the world and beyond. "For now," he continued, his tone softening fractionally, "rest, heal. Take comfort in your families and packmates. We survived this night together, and that unity is our greatest strength. Dismissal was implicit, and people began to disperse, some to return to damaged homes, others to remain in the fortified structures, until morning light made the territory feel safer. My mother stood, preparing to join the exodus, but I remained seated, my eyes on Ronan. He noticed, of course. Noticed and moved toward me again. "Margaret," he said to my mother, his tone respectful. "Your daughter and I have matters to discuss. Would you permit me some time with her? I give you my word she'll be completely safe." My mother's eyes moved between us, reading something in the air that made her expression shift through surprise to understanding to something that looked like cautious hope. "Of course, Alpha King," she said softly. Then to me, "I'll be in the eastern wing if you need me." She left, and suddenly Ronan and I stood alone in the gradually emptying room, the space between us charged with everything unspoken. "Come," he said, offering his hand. I took it, feeling the strength in his fingers, the calluses from weapons and training, the warmth that seemed to spread through my entire body from that single point of contact. He led me deeper into the residence, through corridors lined with history and power, until we reached a private study. The room was intimate, bookcases lining the walls, a fireplace where flames danced lazily, comfortable furniture that spoke of long hours spent here in thought and solitude. Ronan released my hand to close the door, ensuring privacy, then turned to face me fully. And in his eyes, I saw everything that was about to change. The study felt smaller with just the two of us, the walls seeming to lean inward, as if the room itself recognized the weight of this moment. Ronan moved to a small table where crystal decanters held amber liquid, pouring 2 glasses with hands that had killed rogues hours earlier, but now moved with careful precision. He offered me one, and I took it, our fingers brushing. The touch sent electricity racing up my arm. "I don't understand any of this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. 2 days ago, I was invisible. Now I'm standing in the Alpha King's private study, and people are staring at me like I'm something dangerous or precious or both. Ronan took a slow sip of his drink, his storm-gray eyes never leaving my face. "You were never invisible, Evelyn. You only thought you were because people refused to see you. There's a difference. That's just semantics. No." He set his glass down with deliberate care. "It's truth. I've watched you for longer than you know. Months, actually. The way you move through pack territory like a ghost, trying so hard not to take up space. The kindness in your eyes when you think no one's looking. The way you help others without expecting recognition." He moved closer, and I could smell pine and smoke, and something uniquely him. "You fascinated me before I had words for why." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Why didn't you say anything? Why wait until—" "Because I'm the Alpha King," he said simply. "Every action I take is scrutinized, interpreted, used as precedent. If I'd approached you without cause, without public reason, I would have made you a target. Given my enemies, and yes, even I have enemies, ammunition to hurt you to hurt me." His jaw tightened. "I needed the right moment, the right catalyst that would justify bringing you into my sphere publicly." "Little Lily," I breathed, understanding flooding through me. "Little Lily," he confirmed. "Who gave me the perfect reason to acknowledge what I'd been observing for months. Your courage, your compassion, your instinct to move toward need, rather than away from it." He reached out slowly, giving me time to retreat, and tucked a strand of pale hair behind my ear. "You followed me to that mill without hesitation. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How many supposedly strong wolves would have calculated the risk and stayed behind?" "I didn't think," I admitted. "I just moved." "Exactly." His hand lingered near my face, his thumb brushing my cheekbone in an echo of the gesture he'd made in front of the entire pack. "That's who you are, Evelyn. Someone who acts from the heart even when the head says it's foolish. That's what I need. What this pack needs. What I—" He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his features. "What I've been looking for without knowing I was looking." The confession hung between us, raw and honest. I set my glass down with trembling hands. "I'm nobody," I whispered. "I have no training, no rank. No experience with leadership or politics or... You have something better. Ronan's voice was soft but certain. You have integrity that can't be taught. Compassion that hasn't been corrupted by power. Courage that exists without the buffer of strength. His hands framed my face, cradling it like something precious. I've spent 7 years trying to change a culture built on dominance. Trying to show that true strength includes mercy, but I can't do it alone, and I can't do it with advisors who only tell me what they think I want to hear. What are you asking me? My voice cracked on the question. I'm asking you to stand beside me. His forehead touched mine, his breath warm against my skin. Not as a servant or a subject, but as an equal. As someone who challenges me, who reminds me why I'm fighting to build something better. As... He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that stole my breath. As my mate. The world tilted on its axis. Mate, the word that defined everything in wolf society. Partnership, protection, unbreakable bond. An alpha king choosing a mate was a political act as much as a personal one. A statement of values and vision. The claiming ceremony, I stammered. It's tomorrow. There are females from ranked families who've been preparing their entire lives. I don't want them. Ronan's voice was absolute. I want someone who sees me, not just my title. Someone who followed me into danger without calculating what she'd gain. Someone whose first instinct is to protect others even when it puts herself at risk. His thumbs traced my cheekbones. I want you, Evelyn Thorne. If you'll have me. Tears burned behind my eyes. Tears of disbelief and hope and terror at everything this meant. People will say you're making a mistake. That you should choose someone strong, someone worthy of... You are worthy. He said it like law, like something that couldn't be disputed. And anyone who says otherwise will answer to me. I thought of my father, dead before I was born but alive in my mother's stories, of his belief that compassion was strength, that mercy mattered in a world of predators. I thought of my mother, who had survived 20 years of poverty and isolation, but never let it make her cruel. I thought of little Lily, who had run to an alpha king for help and been answered, and I thought of Ronan, lonely in his power, trying to build something better without the support he needed. Yes, I whispered, the word feeling like jumping off a cliff and growing wings simultaneously. Yes, I'll stand beside you. The kiss that followed was inevitable and earth-shattering. Ronan's lips claimed mine with a hunger that spoke of months of restraint finally breaking, and I responded with equal fervor. My hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. He tasted like smoke and whiskey and promises, and when his arms wrapped around me, I felt safer than I'd ever felt in my life despite the violence those arms could deliver. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ronan rested his forehead against mine again. The ceremony tomorrow, he said quietly. I'll announce you as my chosen mate. It will cause upheaval. Families who expected their daughters to be selected will be angry. There will be resistance, possibly danger. I know, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice, but I'm not afraid. Not if you're beside me. His smile transformed his face, softening the harsh lines into something breathtaking. We'll face it together then. The claiming ceremony dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed too cheerful for the chaos about to unfold. My mother helped me dress in a gown that had been delivered at dawn, deep silver that caught the light like moonlight on water, elegant and unmistakably marking me as someone significant. Her hands shook as she fastened the delicate buttons. Your father would be so proud, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. So impossibly proud. I hugged her tightly, drawing strength from her presence, from the love that had sustained us through 20 years of hardship. The ceremony took place in the great clearing at the heart of Pack territory, where generations of wolves had gathered for important rituals. Pack members filled every available space, their faces reflecting curiosity, excitement, and in some cases, poorly concealed hostility. The ranked families sat in positions of honor, their daughters dressed in their finest, expecting their names to be called. Ronan stood at the center on a raised platform, magnificent in formal black, his presence commanding absolute attention. When his eyes found mine in the crowd, The intensity in them made my knees weak. The traditional words were spoken. Ancient phrases about strength and unity, about the bond between alpha and mate, about the future of the pack. And then came the moment everyone waited for. "I have made my choice," Ronan declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the clearing. "My mate will be someone who embodies the values I seek to build in this pack, someone who demonstrates that true strength includes compassion, that courage exists beyond physical dominance, that the power to protect is meaningless without the wisdom to know when mercy matters more than punishment." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the standard announcement. "Evelyn Thorne," Ronan called, extending his hand toward me. "Will you join me?" The silence that followed was deafening. Hundreds of eyes turned to me, some shocked, some furious, some cautiously hopeful. I felt the weight of every judgment, every expectation, every doubt. But I also felt my mother's hand squeeze mine once before releasing me. Felt the memory of my father's words about compassion. Felt the pull of the bond forming between Ronan and me, invisible but undeniable. I walked forward, my head high, my steps steady. When I reached the platform, Ronan's hand closed around mine, warm and certain, and together we faced the pack. "This is my choice," he said firmly. "This is my mate, and anyone who cannot accept this has no place in the pack I'm building." The challenge was unmistakable. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, wolves began to kneel, first a few, then more, then entire families bowing in acknowledgement. Not everyone. Diana Ravencroft and several ranked families remained standing, their faces twisted with fury, but enough bowed that the message was clear. The pack recognized their Alpha King's choice. Ronan turned to me, his hands framing my face, and kissed me in front of everyone, claiming me, protecting me, announcing to the world that I was his and he was mine. When we broke apart, his smile was triumphant and tender in equal measure. "Together," he murmured. Too quiet for anyone else to hear. "Together," I agreed. The weeks that followed were challenging in ways I hadn't imagined, learning pack politics, navigating resentful ranked families, discovering how to wield influence without formal training. But Ronan was beside me through all of it, patient and supportive, teaching me what I needed to know while trusting my instincts. And gradually, things changed. Policies shifted to protect the vulnerable. Pack law was revised to value compassion alongside strength. Wolves who had been invisible, like I once was, found their voices heard. 6 months after the claiming ceremony, I stood in the healer's quarters visiting Charlotte and Lily. The little girl who had started everything threw herself into my arms with the confidence of a child who knew she was safe, who knew she mattered. "Luna Evelyn," she squealed. "Mama says you're going to have a baby." I laughed, my hand moving instinctively to my still flat stomach where new life grew. "Mama's right," I confirmed, catching Charlotte's knowing smile. That evening, I stood with Ronan on the terrace where he'd first asked me to trust him, his arms wrapped around me from behind, his hand covering mine over our growing child. "Regrets?" he asked softly. I leaned back against his solid warmth, watching the sun set over packlands that had become home in ways I'd never imagined possible. "Not one," I answered truthfully, because somewhere between being invisible and standing beside an Alpha King, between surviving and thriving, I had discovered something profound. Strength came in countless forms, and sometimes the bravest thing you could do was believe you deserved more than just survival. I had found belonging, purpose, love. And together, Ronan and I were building something better, a pack where compassion wasn't weakness, where courage mattered more than dominance, where even the invisible could become essential, where even a nobody could become a queen.